Hello, I think we are starting now. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Sawadee. My name is Book or Benjapan Pomahat. I'm from British Council, Thailand. And on behalf of the Conference Steering Committee, we'd like to welcome you to the Celebrating Language and Diversity webinar, and also the launch of the IMMLE conference proceedings. Before we start, I'll give you a little bit of the logistic information. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording of the webinar on the conference website. So please make sure that you check out the conference website afterward. And also we'll be posting a lot of updated information. So please make sure you check it out. And the second of all, this webinar is a 1 hour long webinar. The first 40 minutes will be focusing on discussion on related issue with our panelists. And the last 20 minutes will be allocated to the Q&A session. It's also important to address here that the audience cannot speak or interact directly with our panelists, but we have the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So please make sure that if you have questions or comments, you can drop your question from there. And the last point for me is that we will be posting the link of the post-webinar survey in the Q&A box. So please make sure that you spend a couple minutes after the webinar finished to provide us some feedback and also the idea for the future webinar as well. And that is it for me. Now I'm handing you over to Mike Solly, who is going to share today's session. Mike is our principal consultant of English for Education system at the British Council. He leads our global work on language for resilience, which work with refugees and migrants, as well as the communities that support them. He is also a language and development conference trustee. Please welcome Mike.
Thank you very much, Book, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Celebrating Language and Diversity webinar. As Book says, in this webinar, we'll also be launching the proceedings of the Inclusion, Mobility and Multilingual Education Conference, which took place in Bangkok at the end of last year, which seems a very long time ago now, of course. So I will begin by asking some questions to the panel from me. And during this period, you can just type in any questions you have at any point into the question and answer box. And then, as Book said, we'll have about 20 minutes at the end. Just to say that I think we've got a lot of people registered for this, around 1,000 people from all continents in the world. Well, that's probably a slight exaggeration. I don't think we have anyone from Antarctica, but you never know. And it may be difficult to pick up on everybody's questions, although I'll do my best. So if yours isn't answered, we will try and get back to you with an answer to that question, perhaps in some other form, which we'll think about a bit later. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. First of all, we have Alison Barrett, MBE, and she is the British Council's Regional Director for Education and Society in East Asia. Alison has held several senior management positions in the British Council, leading large-scale English language teacher education programmes and partnerships designed to improve the quality of English language policy and practice. Next, we have Chris Sultan. Chris is an international education consultant specialising in ELT, who has worked on many education and language projects in the Global South for organisations including the British Council, Cambridge University Press and a whole range of NGOs. Chris was also the academic consultant for the IMMLE conference and is the editor of the conference proceedings. Thirdly, we have Maki Katsuno Hayakashawa. Maki is the chief of the section for inclusive quality education at UNESCO. She oversees UNESCO's regional programme in the Asia Pacific in the fields of education policy and planning, ICT in education, learning and quality, and inclusion and gender in education from early childhood to secondary education. She is also the regional coordinator for the SDG 4 Education 2030. We have Psyche Kennett, who is a fellow trustee of the Language and Development Conference Series and did a plenary at the conference on language and inclusion, framing the debate. She is currently working as the technical lead on a programme for reducing language barriers, which is part of a British Council GIZ EU project on supporting reconciliation in Sri Lanka. And then we have Wilat Tor Kamikain, who is a teacher of English based in Thailand's Ubon Ratchathani province. He has worked as a teacher trainer and educator for 20 years, both in government and non-government organisations. Recently, he successfully worked as one of the Thai master trainers in the Boot Camp project, one of the mega teacher development training programmes in Thailand, supported by the Ministry of Education and the British Council. He was also one of the conference presenters on the topic large-scale in-service teacher development programmes and the reduction of national inequality in Thailand. So I'd just like to begin with my first question, which I'm going to ask everybody or all panel members to give me their take on this. I have to say that I've given them a little bit of time, a bit of notice with this question, so I'm hoping that their answers will be quite short. The question is, and we'll begin with Maki and then go on to Tor initially. So Maki, what does cultural diversity in relation to language mean to you, both globally and in the contexts that you live and work in?
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there. Very happy to be the first runner for this question, the very first question for the seminar. Well, for me, and also especially, I would have to say for UNESCO, language is really all about cultural diversity and vice versa. Cultural diversity itself is our shared heritage. It presents a lot of great opportunity for humanity to expand and innovate and develop further. It's a cultural diversity is a way to invite more dialogue, discovery, and cooperation. Now, for us, the first, I think the cultural diversity can actually take many forms, and language is actually perhaps one of the first diversity that we encounter as our social beings. And language itself defines our internal world just as much as it defines the way we communicate with the outside world. And it is also, language is what connects us to the roots, our culture and history, but also our communities and our families. Now, as according to the Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity of 2001, and promoted by UNESCO, cultural diversity is something that widens the range of our options to and open to everyone. It's one of the roots of development, and it cannot be just in terms of economic growth of development, but it means to achieve more satisfactory intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual existence, which means, in other words, without language, we have no cultural diversity. But then without cultural diversity, we don't have that rich diversity in language that really informs our history, our civilization, and so on today. So to that, UNESCO is very much guided by the importance of language and also the richness in culture that we inherit in our civilization. And we also have a position paper that talks about this very clearly, that we understand that language is an essential component for intercultural education and dialogue, and also to that means to understand better the different thinking, the different cultures among different population groups, and in order to ensure the respect for fundamental human rights. So I would say that language is not only about communication means. Of course, we need language to transmit culture, but also the diversity of culture itself is enriching our language as well. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Maki. Okay, and now I'd like to go with the same question over to you, Tor, if I could.
We start with the simple phrases or quote that we say that everyone needs to be counted, and from Ministry of Education and also the policies that implement to the projects that we handle here in Thailand. We require that all over Thailand we use the mother tongue as the Thai language, but as the language teachers and also the teachers trainers, we concerned about like the language or linguistic diversities, and we maintain that the teachers, parent or the teachers educators needs to know things that like a student can only learn through the language that they know and understand. So Thai or even the language that used in their regions could be implemented using in the lessons, or even like help them to higher their literacies more. And the second thing that we concerned is about like most students cannot achieve the level of proficiencies of English unless they developed the high level of proficiencies in their home language too. And at last, to me, as their language teacher again in higher secondary school, we think that students cannot use English as the medium instructions for learning across the curriculum successfully unless they have a strong proficiencies in their home language, Thai could be, and they have developed literacies in both their home language and English, right? This is from my perspective and understanding, and along with the policy implementations with the projects in Thailand that we had done before. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tor. I'd just like to, for people that might have come in a little bit late, just to remind you of what this first question is. So it's, what does cultural diversity in relation to language mean to you, both globally and in the context you live and work in? And now I'd like to just pass over to Alison.
Thanks very much, Mike, and welcome everybody today. This question for me is where the personal and the professional really intersect, probably in a similar way to Maki, in that, working for the British Council, which is the UK's cultural relations organisation, language for us is really critical in achieving our mission. It sustains cultural diversity, it enables cultural engagement and understanding, it supports intercultural competence and fluency between people from different cultures and different countries and geographies. And it really also helps provide the glue that enables us to kind of really work together and build a new future and a new understanding together. But having started my career with the British Council as a language teacher, a bit like Tor, it's a really important area for me because overseeing our education programmes, it's important that we think about language, not just English language, but how English operates within languages across the curriculum and languages in education in a much more multilingual world. And so, yeah, very, very important for everything that I do.
Thank you, Alison. I think that's something that underlies a lot of what we're talking about today. It's the place of English in a multilingual world. Okay, and now I'd like to go over to Chris, please.
Thanks, Mike, and hello to everybody. Yeah, I'd just like to build a little bit on what Tor was just saying and thinking about language learning at the classroom level. And I think in a world which is likely to enter a period of deglobalization because of the current pandemic, and we're likely to see greater educational inequalities, I think having cultural diversity at the heart of language learning is crucial. We see this at the macro level with, what Trump is saying in the US, or the Chinese and India skirmishes in Ladakh and Sikkim, that we need as educators not just to tolerate or nod to cultural diversity and multilingualism, but I think we really need to embrace it fully and use it as an effective and enhancing pedagogic tool. Just to give a quick example of this, I saw in Amman, Jordan, there was an NGO called Mosaic who run education classes for refugees from many different nationalities. So there was Sudanese, Somali, Kurdish, Iraqi, Syrian, and other groups. And they were using language learning as a way of talking about contentious issues. So they were embracing their own cultural diversity. They were using it as a platform to explore their ideas, but also using it as a vehicle to develop languages as well. And I think in this way, the means of learning language, the process, as well as the outcome, can be really valuable. And I think cultural diversity is at the centre of that.
Great, thank you very much for that, Chris. And finally, I'd like to move over to Psyche.
Thank you, Mike, and hello, everybody. For me, I think language and cultural diversity has a particular resonance at this time with the Black Lives Matter movement across the world. And for me, it's really important to think about institutional cultures, language and diversity. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is in many ways wanting to address institutional discrimination and exclusion. And the work I'm doing at the moment in Sri Lanka is reducing language barriers amongst public servants. So working with the police and civil authorities, local authorities in education and health, and getting them to embrace institutional cultural diversity by learning other languages, by learning to speak Tamil so that they can offer basic public services to the Tamil public in their own language. So I think there's a political dimension here and an institutional dimension as well.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panel members for, I think, framing this conversation really well. I mean, we can see we're at a point in history where inclusion and multilingualism is relevant in just so many of the geopolitical areas, that some of which have been raised now. Okay, my next question, this is for Chris, actually, particularly for Chris, as it is on the conference last November. So the Inclusion, Mobility and Multilingual Education Conference joined forces last time with the Language and Development Conference and held a joint event for the first time in Bangkok. The joint event was the first time bit. Chris, you edited the dynamic and very informative proceedings for the event. For the benefit of those attending today who were not able to be there, perhaps you could say a little about it, and also how it came about that the proceedings took the shape they did. And perhaps you could say a little about that shape.
Yeah, of course. And hopefully, just to say, hopefully you can all access this if you haven't seen it already. There should be a link, I think, in the Q&A box for you to look at. So yeah, the driving idea behind the publication was about creating a document which was practically useful and valuable for people who were at the conference, but also those who weren't there, but who weren't able to be there. And we wanted to capture not just what happened at the conference, but also the spirit of the conference as well. So some of the things that we tried to do within the document was very much to capture the voices of the people who were there, all people who were there, not just the keynote speakers, but also the teachers, the trainers, the NGO workers, government officials, and so on, from all over the world, with their wide and varied experiences and really try to capture and summarize that. Because I think certainly my own experience, one of the great strengths of going to these sorts of conferences is that you get all these experiences from different parts of the world in different educational situations. So, for example, in the document we include information, you know, on one page you might find out about the challenges of teaching in multilingual education in Nepal, or learning about the experience of government policy in the Philippines over the last decade, or about the challenges of language and instruction in tribal areas of Kerala. So you get all these different experiences which the reader themselves are then able to apply to their own context. We also try to recognise that social media plays a huge role in conferences, and to welcome that. And I think you really get a richness of information as people are reflecting on what they hear at that very moment in time, at that particular moment. So we were trying to channel a lot of that information as well, and feed that in. So it was a very much a bottom-up process that we used. Also recognising that people who come to these conferences come from very different knowledge bases. Some might be fairly inexperienced or newly qualified teachers. Some might have been working in this field for 40 or 50 years. So what we try to do is to provide links and additional sources of information so that people were able to access all of those information. And in concert with the post-conference proceedings, we also created a pre-conference booklet as well to support people in doing that. So to give people some sources to refer back to other conferences in this series before, to talk about the three key themes that we looked at: mobility, inclusion, and multilingual education. And also we were a digital first publication, which I think is sort of fairly unusual concept in the field that we're working in. Although of course this may be changing because of COVID-19 and so on as more things go online, but we wanted to use hyperlinks, integrate video, interesting and enhancing graphics and so on, but also the style in which it was written was different to a lot of previous It's more shorter, focused, summary, bite-type information pieces, because we wanted to appeal to the widest possible audience, really, so that language wasn't a barrier to learning about what happened there. And I think the last thing to say is that we tried to make the proceedings seen as part of a process, so it's not just a one-off publication, but to build on what has happened before and to look to the future as well. So, we captured a lot of the voices of participants about what they want to do in the future, what they would want future conferences to look like, and also some of the unanswered questions from the conference which people want to carry on discussing. So those are some of the sort of the key points from that, but so hopefully as people see it, and that sort of it makes sense when they're able to actually look at the proceedings themselves.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. That's very interesting. And as you say, I guess we are all in in some ways the style of the proceedings. Well, we weren't to know what was around the corner, but they're anticipating changes that are going to affect us all in the very way that conferences are run, for one thing. Just staying with the conference for a moment, a question generally for you. I'd like you to tell us about what the conference, and what particular needs was the conference addressing. And perhaps I can begin with you, Alison, and then perhaps over to Psyche.
Sure, thanks very much, Mike. Well, the conference, as you said at the beginning, it was the first time that the three organising partners came together to bring this joint conference to an international audience. So it was the Language and Development Trustees, who hold a conference every 2 years and have done for several decades. The UNESCO office in Bangkok, representing the Asia Multilingual Mother Tongue-Based Education Working Group, and the British Council. And together we have a very clear shared objective to make sure that multilingual approaches are enhanced and can support better outcomes for communities, for those in formal education and non-formal education, for wider society, and also to increase sort of civic engagement and connections with the issues that we were debating. We held it in Bangkok for a number of reasons. Psyche might want to say more about that from the Language and Development Trustee perspective, but from an East Asia perspective, this is the home of about 50% of the world's languages. Over 3,000 languages are in this region. It's a very diverse and multilingual region. It's a region where we're seeing a really rapid growth in the use of English as a possible medium of instruction. And that's being seen at all levels, from basic education right the way through to higher education. And from the British Council's perspective, it's really important that we engage with that particular phenomenon, because English is not always the right choice for the medium of instruction. And for us, we want to really support a much more multilingual and diverse and inclusive approach to education, where the choice of language is informed by contextual needs, is supported by institutional policies and capacity, and by the appropriate language policies at the national level as well. So that was an opportunity for us to really debate those issues. It's also a time in history, from one of our plenary speakers, Hal Coleman's session, if any of you attended, where we're seeing huge amounts of movement. Obviously, COVID has sort of put a different perspective on that, and mobility now is virtual mobility, isn't it, over the last few months? But it's a time where we're seeing over 24 million, I think, young people displaced, refugees and migrants who are having to access services in countries not necessarily their own, study through languages that aren't necessarily their own. And so it's a really important time for us to be addressing some of those specific needs as well.
Okay, thank you, Alison. And Psyche, would you like to follow up on that?
Well, yes. Mike and Alison, you've both mentioned that it was a joint conference, and although the Language and Development Trustees have worked closely for several years with the Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group, it is the first time the two conferences came together. So it was the 13th Language and Development Conference and the 6th Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group conference. And for the Language and Development Conference series, it did have some historic resonance, because the conference returned to Bangkok after more than 25 years. The very first Language and Development Conference in 1993 kicked off in Bangkok. So this was a quarter of a century later. And it was very pleasing and rewarding to see how the debate has moved on, and how many things have changed, particularly with regard to the provision of multilingual education, and particularly at primary level. And that was offset, however, by the fact that there are still some issues that remain after all these years, particularly engaging donors, and really engaging policymakers at national level to go beyond projects to make national curricula and teacher training changes. So I think in this milieu of the joint conference, it was great to see that it had, as a joint event, had that kudos to host the high-level policy forum and to produce the Bangkok statement, which I think we're going to discuss a bit later. But that was really quite powerful that the event could produce that.
Great. Thanks very much, Psyche. Thank you, Alison. Still on the theme of the conference, I'd just like to begin with Tor, if I could, and ask the question, what did you learn or take away from the conference in a practical sense? And I think this probably also addresses one of the questions that we've just had in from Jason, and in what kind of practical ways can you apply this in the classroom? And what have you done as a result of the conference?
All right. We have we have a chance to present the policy things and the practice thing in the real workshop that we cooperate with the British Councils and with the Ministry of Education for uphold the projects for the teachers, which is we think about the best thing that I can take away and then relate it to the peoples that we work with. I link back to the conference aim that the first thing that they say that we can we create the linkage between policy, practice, and the research on how multilingual approach can be used in advance to participate, access for the learned and the children's, and adapt for the marginalized and mobile communities. So this is one considers to be the most interesting that we take back to our communities and also our regions. When we finish that, we concerned about that how then the government and also the policies after this can concerns more about their multilingual approaches, and then we try to create the impact and on the workshops that we designed the modules like that we have like a module that we raise the awareness of using L1 or mother tongues in language classroom, and also we think about the approach that we can use it in a stage when we design the lesson planning. One of the stages in the training session that we have discussed since as we have like the using L1 as the medium language using in the training and also in the classroom, we think about that we can create the atmosphere for the student and for the teacher to start to reflect themselves, sharing things about their own communities, use their own language sometimes, and also create the presentation that they have gaps or ways to present their identities. This is very interesting because we're not raising only their awareness, but we still keep it on build their own identity clearly amongst the language classroom. So there's one activity that I can name, like we call names, what's that, name activities. You know that everyone's from Laos communities, from Cambodian communities, and also from Chinese community, and they are from the different areas in Thailand, but they come to the same school. But that time we have create the space for everyone that they have the storytelling, and then they create the name card and tell everyone that how is it important, what their names mean. This is very interesting and it's wonderful. After we linked it between the policies and do it or implement it in the training workshop, later on it happens in the classroom. All right, I think that's very, this is the most interesting thing. The second that I can say, it's about like we create the networking, right, amongst the country that we found the peoples. Like recently from the workshops, the peoples who joined the meeting they're not from only the Thai or across the country from Europeans, but mostly they are from Asia. So we can learn and link together. Lately, we have the connections with our British cousins and also the support of Hornby Trust. We talk about like how can we create associations of English teachers amongst the ASEAN country, and then we can learn towards the language that we speak and also the lesson learned from each countries. So this is very interesting because we gather the peoples in the conference in face-to-face, and we have a chance to exchange the resources or to the curriculum and the pedagogies. This is the wonderful message that I can say from the takeaway things in the conference rooms. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Tor. I just say I mentioned that Jason had a question about sharing best practices, and I think you partially cover it there. And also there are, I know, a number of resources, particularly around this area, that have been produced, and we'll make sure that we post a link to those resources. Alison, just to go over to you for a moment.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I just took the liberty, Mike, if you don't mind, of posting one of the links to a practical resource book of ideas, strategies, and classroom activities for multilingual classrooms that we also launched at the conference. Was also edited by Catherine, one of our plenary speakers at the conference, and you might find that helpful. But I think the starting point that I always find very useful is in many of the contexts where we're working, students come to the classroom already with a huge number of languages at their fingertips. They're often speaking one language at home, another at school, another with friends or colleagues or relatives, and so not to be afraid of thinking, first of all, what languages do you have in your classroom, making the students feel proud that they actually speak all those different languages and building their confidence, and not seeing the use of other languages apart from the home language as the wrong thing to do, but actually to build on something that Chris said earlier. Language is a resource, it's a tool that a teacher can use within the classroom. We know from research that teachers with good communication skills and teachers who code switch, they flip between different languages for different reasons, to build conceptual understanding or to clarify or to include, are going to be much more successful at generating deeper learning outcomes. So, we really need to embrace it and to start with a very positive recognition of the value that those languages bring to the learning process. Yes,
thank you, Alison, and that was not taking a liberty in the least to post that. Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Then thank you also for your question, Jason. Just Chris, I can see you want to come in, so very quickly over to you on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one very quick, very simple activity that people can use, which is just task repetition. And I think, encouraging people, for example, to do a task in their L1 at first, and then you can ask them to repeat that same task in the target language, whether that's English or whatever else it may be, just as a way of promoting multilingualism in the classroom, not being afraid of using L1 as a bridge, as a scaffold to the target language. So I would just want to add that as a simple task that people can do.
Great. OK, thanks for that, Chris. I'd like to move forward to our next question, and to begin with Psyche on this one. What are the SDG language indicators aiming to achieve, and why? We mentioned the SDGs a little earlier. So what are they aiming to achieve and why?
Thanks, Mike. I think there are 4 sustainable development goals that impact on language inclusion, mobility and multilingual education. And the first one Maki referred to right at the beginning of our webinar, the SDG 4, which is for inclusive quality education. What we're talking about here is quality mother tongue early education, and avoiding that cliff edge very often at grade 4 in primary school with a sudden switch to national languages, sometimes switch to English without proper scaffolding and transition. And I think that it's important, the SDG is important because local languages need to be dealt with by local education authorities at local level. But the way education funding is structured around the world is it's national. And if the national budget can't flow to the local level, then this SDG 4 for quality education and language provision in home languages is not going to happen. So that's the first and the primary SDG. But I think also Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is about gender equality and empowering women and girls. Unless language is factored into girls' education, there are so many pressures on girls in many countries to drop out early. They don't continue to secondary school. They get locked into early marriage or informal work. And don't continue their education. So if language is a further barrier, then girls are trapped in a downward spiral of never breaking out of that and moving on to higher education. And particularly this issue of refugees and the mobility in languages debate. There's an increasing awareness of school-related gender-based violence. And so if you have that intersectionality of refugee girls who are already discriminated against because of gender, but then they are further discriminated because they don't speak the language of the classroom and they come from a different ethnic background in that host country, that SDG 5 on gender becomes really important. And the two others are the SDG 10, which is about social and economic and political equality, and SDG 16, which is the one we're particularly working on in Sri Lanka, which is about promoting just and peaceful societies. And that's that whole debate about what the role language plays in social justice and civil justice. So if you can't access a fair trial, or if you're not represented in parliament or in the media because of your language, or if you can't get your social service benefits or healthcare because the nurse or the social worker doesn't speak your language, then you are excluded from the fair distribution of resources and things which will bring you out of poverty. And so those two, 10 and 16 are also important. So why are these important? Well, all the countries represented in the SDGs are signatories to that international agreement. So this is a way that communities and governments and in your own locality, you can hold your government responsible because they've signed up to this. So it's a platform for advocacy as well as a broader statement of what we should be aiming at. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Psyche. And in a moment, I'm going to come on to a question from Liesel, I believe it is, from the audience. But first, related to that, I would just like to ask Maki. There was a policy forum that took place as a part of the conference. Perhaps, Maki, you could tell us something about this policy forum and its outcomes.
Thank you, Mike. We'll be happy to. Well, we have under the MLA working group in Asia Pacific, we'll be organizing the regional conference at MLA, and of course, last week we joined up with the partners. But since the conference started in 2003, we have been organizing a parallel policy forum with government officials, senior government officials since 2008. And last year, the last meeting, we organized the 5th session of a policy forum, a ministerial roundtable, I would say, inviting high-level officials from 16 countries in the regions, including observers from key MLA stakeholders. And we organized 3 roundtables during the conference to discuss and share experiences and how we can collectively strengthen and improve the quality of mother tongue-based multilingual education program policy, especially within the context of SDG 4 now. Now, I have to say that this year was a special, this time the conference, policy from the special conference, because we actually came out with the first regional statement on multilingual education called the Bangkok Statement on Language and Inclusion. So this is, I hope the audience can see on the screen. It's a very simple statement, but it is actually a historical statement in the sense that this was the first time ever that the senior government officials, some of them actually being a minister and vice ministers, agreed to endorse such a statement in writing on the importance of multilingual education. Now, we had these policy forums already 4 times beforehand, before this. All the 4 policy forums in the past were basically a kind of a closed door meeting, and there was nothing coming out as a written document because given the sensitivity, often politically sensitive issue with languages, the government official would come to the table, but they wouldn't want to have anything go out of the room. And so it has taken us almost basically 10 years to get to this point, to have something that governments can actually use to promote the importance of multilingual education as well. Now, the statement includes 7 action areas, action points. First is highlighting language of instruction issues, then fostering investment for quality MLA. Second is to promote enhancing the quality MLA. It talks about diversifying the teacher workforce and building teacher capacity. It talks about the importance of gathering data disaggregated by home or first language, and also to emphasize strengthening the partnership with relevant stakeholders and partners. And lastly, but of course not the least, but the seventh point was on preparing national progress reports, so that we encourage government to kind of keep track of progress on this on language issues, particularly with reference to the thematic indicator on SDG 4.5.2, which talks about the language instruction in the classroom. So I think we have come a long way over the last 10 years, but it is really a great achievement for the region to get this statement out. Now, in addition, after this, the follow-up, we have been able to translate this statement to 6 regional languages so far, into Thai, Khmer, Myanmar, Tetun, Bahasa Indonesia, and Malaysia. So we hope that other countries will follow suit, translate in their own languages, and hopefully not just with the official languages, but even with the ethnic indigenous languages as much as possible as well. So let me stop here.
Thank you. That's very clear, and I think some interesting thoughts for other countries to take forward there, possibly. Perhaps on that note, I'd just like to bring in a question from the audience here. Lysel in the Philippines. I will try and put this into my own words if I may, and I hope I've got this right. Lysel, forgive me if I haven't. But in the Philippines, evidently, there has been a policy for over 10 years of using mother tongue as a first language for years, a K-3 curriculum. I'm not quite sure what that means in the Philippine context. But evidently, there have been issues around the variations, particularly with reading skills, in what mother tongue might mean. And Lysel is just asking if this has been an issue anywhere else, and perhaps if any of you have are aware of those kind of complications of what mother tongue might mean in different contexts. Okay, Psyche.
Well, just for starters, if you have a national curriculum that is then going to be translated into different home languages in different localities or sub-governmental areas, you really have to have, it can't just be a translation job. So anything in a textbook that children are going to read, it has to be developed sensitively and by teachers who are not only good at methodology, but are creative writers as well. And I think this is a really big challenge which needs to be factored in, and teacher training colleges tend to be in the national languages. So where do you get your stock of teachers who are going to make the multiple versions and the reading and writing components of those textbooks? I think the oral components are easier, but particularly the reading texts and written parts of the textbooks, who's going to do it? And I think this is a really crucial area that we need to address.
Yeah. I know that this is an issue that has come up a lot in parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. Okay, thank you. Just to remind you again, if you want to post any questions, please do so, and I will try to incorporate them. Thank you for that question, Lysel, in the Philippines. I'd just like to ask, there was how will you use the statement, the policy statement from the Bangkok conference in your work? And Alison, perhaps I could start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. I think this is really important because we often go to conferences and we pick up brochures and books and we come back and we put them on our shelf and we sort of forget about them. So this webinar is partly to help us think through how we can use the outputs of conferences and sort of further the thinking and the debate. But also I think with policy statements, there's also risk that we assume as practitioners that it's not relevant to us, or that we, it's not a conversation that we're privy to, we don't have access to. Whereas actually as practitioners, it's really important that we understand the policy commitments, the policy goals of the context in which we're working, and we see how we can further those goals in our own kind of context, whether that's classroom or institution, etc. So one kind of recommendation for me would be to sort of make sure you read it, understand it, and translate those actions for you in your own work, because you'll find some very practical ideas will emerge from that very simple exercise. In terms of the British Council, it's also really important that we are using tools to advocate for best practice. So we are fortunate to be working in partnership with a number of governments across the globe to support them in language education initiatives and programs. So one of the ways that we will use it is to inform some of the design of those programs. We may try and embed some of the actions into the programming design and try and achieve outcomes that support those national government action plans. We're often part of sector working groups in many countries where we're able to share latest thinking or research evidence with other development partners or with national education bodies. So using those platforms and opportunities to show and promote the statement and to connect participants with UNESCO and with the expertise within the working group. Thinking about teacher capacity building, and again connecting the teachers and the educators we work with to those policy statements and helping them think through how they might use it. Also, Action 5 is about helping provide disaggregated data so that data can really drive really informed solutions. So we often have data that we generate through webinars like this or through other programs. So sharing that data again with those national governments so that they can see what diversity of languages they might have in the classrooms, in teacher education colleges, and that helps then inform better solutions. So I think there's a whole range of ways, but the big takeaway for me is it's relevant to all of us. It's not just for policymakers.
Thanks, Alison. Chris, I'd like, and just before going over to you, Chris, I'd also just like to say that Ian has put a follow-up to Lysol's earlier question, saying, is it not to do with dialectic variations within the mother tongues which are chosen as mediums of instructions? These variations can make literacy acquisition more difficult for learners. So I think that's a good point, and maybe something that people would like to pick up on. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add and to build a little bit on what Psyche was saying earlier about the SDGs as well. I think one of the problems of the SDGs is that it is they were shaped by political influences, and because language is obviously such a contentious political issue, my reading of the SDGs is that a lot of the points that Psyche was making, you have to infer yourself. They're not explicit within the SDGs. And I think what is good about this statement is it is explicit. It is written by education ministers. It is written with the support of those governments, and it becomes therefore a really useful tool to advocate for multilingual education at the institutional level, at the regional level, at all different levels. And I think it addresses some of those shortcomings that were evident in the Millennium Development Goals, which didn't really get addressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. So hopefully this can actually help people, actors within institutions themselves, to realise the benefits of multilingual education.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else like to come in there? Oh, okay. There's a question, which picks up on something Chris said earlier about our current situation with the pandemic, and I'm asking you now to look forward a bit. In 2 or 3 years' time, when we're looking back at this pandemic, and I'd like to begin with you as well, Chris, if I could, on this. When we're looking back at this pandemic, what would be the changes in attitudes, do you think? Bit of prediction here, towards MLE, towards multilingual education.
I'm not sure about prediction, but I suppose an aspiration is that I hope what we can do is that, in so many countries, what we're seeing is a shift online. to learning. Now, obviously, this is not universal by any means, but in a lot of institutions and systems, that's what's happening. And my own view is that the use of mobile phones within the classroom is a very positive thing, and we can use that to support multilingual education. I think a lot of the research, a lot of the theory does support the use of mobile phones for learning, but still there is a lot of ambivalence or even hostility to that at the systemic and institutional level. And I think just as a basic tool for translating information or as a source of additional information, or whatever it may be, that mobiles can help push forward multilingual education. Because I think if we don't do that, if we don't build on the digital opportunity which I think COVID has given us, then we're not really supporting our students in the best way, because when many of them go into the workplace, they will be using digital integrated into that. So if we don't do that at the classroom level, then I think we're not adequately supporting our students.
Thanks, Chris. So mobile phones in particular could provide some answer. I guess the danger is as well that the inequalities can grow greater owing to technological divides, but that's one that, you know, we're aware of. Okay, over to Psyche on that.
Just to say that we always have to be really careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the migration to learning online, I think it's really important to be able to, you know, hold up something that you've written or actually write something, because we've been making this transition during the lockdown, and we found that the best platforms with the lowest bandwidth, because people maybe don't even have 3G on their network, so you need a low bandwidth to make it an inclusive learning experience. But also those the fonts, like the Sinhala font or the Tamil font, doesn't exist on the best learning platforms. The ones which are the most pragmatic and inclusive technologically only have Roman script. So if we want to have a multilingual approach online, I think we do need to just be super pragmatic and have our whiteboard there, or have a not be reliant too much on the technological tools while using the platform to move ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, Psyche. Okay, I'd just like to move to another question from the audience here. This is from Chris Darby, an important one that relates to the whole idea of multilingualism and perhaps this conversation. Given the potential leverage of the Bangkok Statement, especially for sub-Saharan Africa, has it been translated into French or any other major regional language there? Mackie, Alison?
Yeah.
Mackie.
Yes, for the Bangkok Statement itself, major languages, meaning like the UN languages, for example. I think for us in this region, we have the English as a prototype, of course, coming out of the conference, and we try to encourage countries and partners to translate them as much as possible into the national language at the first level, but then often, you know, even go further down. This document particularly has not been translated into French nor into Chinese. Oh, actually, we should have actually got it in Chinese, because it is also a regional language, not only a UN language, but also hopefully it will be translated in other languages as much as possible. It could be a good model for the other regional countries to study and also even reflect upon as well. I am sure that many of our action plan points are very relevant to not only in the Asia Pacific, but also in Africa and Arab states and Latin America. So we hope that we could actually disseminate further if there is a partner who will help us to translate this in other languages as well.
Great. Thank you. We will watch this space then for that. Thank you very much. Okay, and I think this might need to be the last question. I think this is an important one as well, from Malu, who asks, how do other Asian countries cope when students fail to acknowledge their mother tongue due to modernization and technological advancement? And if I could expand that very slightly to just asking, how do we overcome, or how can teachers and policymakers help to overcome a resistance that is often there to multilingual education. I don't know who would like to. Okay, over to Psyche first on that one.
I think it goes back to institutional change, because in the context of Sri Lanka, but in many other countries too, parents are reluctant for their children to learn in mother tongue if it's going to disadvantage them later in terms of higher education and in terms of jobs. So unless there is that sense of inclusion and diversity within other institutions, the parental attitude is not going to change. And that's why we need to broaden the base of language and development beyond the education sector into the economic, the business communities, and the justice and policing and health services, so that parents feel confident that by studying in home language, their children will have an equal opportunity in society. Now, that's a really big call and beyond the remit of today's webinar, but I think we really need to keep the bigger picture in mind.
Thank you, Psyche, and I think actually that's a very good place to, with that sort of call to arms, if you like, and the need for inclusion, I suppose, to be that multifaceted and to cross what are often seen as boundaries is really key. Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I always get the impression towards the end of these events that, you know, we're just getting started. But I'd like to thank the panel first for today. And I'd like to thank all of you, especially those of you that ask questions. Sorry if we haven't dealt with all of them, but thank you for being with us, and take care. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you for joining.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.